Hello, and welcome to Keep the Channel Open, a podcast featuring conversations with artists, writers, and curators. My name is Mike Sakatsugawa, and this is episode 61. Today's guest is Ty Franck. So I was thinking this morning about a conversation I had a while back. Interestingly enough, it was with Daniel Abraham, who is the writing partner of today's guest, Ty Franck, and who I spoke with way back in episode 11. Daniel had posted to his blog what he called a writing craft philosophical provocation. This was like 5 years ago, and what he asked the readers to discuss in the comments was this. Inaccessibility in a work of art is either a failure of craft or a statement of contempt. And we ended up actually having a pretty great discussion about it, and Ty chimed in a couple of times as well, which, you know, thinking about the good old days of the internet when you could have meaningful and non-awful conversations in a comment section, you know, I miss that sometimes. Anyway, all of this is on my mind, I think, because I recently decided to take my first dive into the work of John Ashbery. I bought a copy of his 1975 collection, Self-Portrait in a Convex Mirror, in my post-Christmas book spree, and started in about a week ago. And you know what? I'm not ashamed to admit this, but I am just completely lost. Okay, maybe I'm a teeny bit ashamed, but no, really. I mean, from everything I've read, Ashbery's poems are pretty widely considered to be difficult to understand, very opaque, the kind of thing that you have to work at. For me, I've been going over each poem 3 times, 4, maybe more times, getting maybe a tiny inkling of what's going on, and then sort of throwing up my hands and Googling for a reading guide. So then this morning, that conversation with Daniel popped into my head. And, you know, if you have the opportunity to talk about art with Daniel Abraham, I do recommend it. It's usually a lot of fun. My argument at the time was that art is about providing an experience to the audience, and there are certain kinds of experiences that can only be had with quote-unquote difficult work, you know, that the act of having to decipher a relatively opaque work of art is an experience in itself. And not to say that obscure work is better or accessible work is better, just that there can be value to both kinds of experiences, which I stand by that. But the interesting thing that Daniel brought up was that when you make something that you know is going to be impenetrable to a certain segment of the audience or maybe potential audience, that you're making the choice to exclude people, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. After all, you know, no work of art can be for everyone, and aiming at being for everyone is probably just a good way of making bad art. But I guess it is sort of interesting to think about whether that exclusion constitutes a form of contempt, even if only in an incidental sort of way. I think a lot lately about my own work, which I don't think is as obscure in any way, but it is intentionally aimed at people who care about the things that I care about and not at anyone else. And I think, too, about the idea of writing for your own people, your own tribe, you know, however you might define that. And I think in some ways that's essential. But insofar as it might be exclusive, that's an interesting thing to contemplate, for me at least. Anyway, if you've got some thoughts, you can always tweet at me at ChannelOpenPod. On to the show. Today's guest, as I mentioned, is Ty Franck, who, along with Daniel Abraham, writes the best-selling science fiction series The Expanse under the name James S.A. Corey. The series comprises 7 books so far, with 2 more forthcoming, the latest of which is this year's Persepolis Rising. The first book in the series, Leviathan Wakes, was nominated for the Hugo and Locus Awards in its year. The third book, Abaddon's Gate, won the Locus Award and was nominated for the Goodreads Choice Award. And the series as a whole was nominated for the Best Series Hugo last year. The series has also been adapted into a popular show on the Sci-Fi Network, the 3rd season of which will be premiering on April 11th. Now, Ty and I have known each other for a good long time, about 15 years now, and I've been a fan of The Expanse since its inception. And by that, I mean its real inception. I was actually one of the players in the first tabletop game that Ty ran in this universe, which eventually became The Expanse that we know today. Ty's legitimately one of my favorite people to hang out with, so I was very happy to finally get him on the show. Now, before we get started, I wanted to mention that I'm going to be giving away a signed copy of Ty and Daniel's latest Expanse book, Persepolis Rising, so stick around after the conversation for details about that. And now let's get started. As always, if you'd like to join in the conversation, you can use the hashtag ChannelOpenPod on Twitter. And now here's my conversation with Ty Franck. There was this conversation that we had a long time ago. It was like 10 years ago at this point, online. And we were talking about what we would do if we didn't have to have a job anymore. I actually went back and found this thing where you said that your entire goal in life is to never have to work again, and you're too lazy to even try very hard. And that just strikes me as really hilarious, because you and Daniel seem to be some of the busiest people that I can think of these days. So how'd that happen?
Well, my plan is still to be retired by 50. Yeah, I don't want a job, but I have like 3 jobs. On the plus side, none of those 3 jobs feel like a 9-to-5 job, that where you drive to the same place every day and you sit in the same cubicle every day and work on the same computer and have meetings with all the same people. Because I got to admit, that was the part that felt like slow death to me. At least now, I'll be perfectly honest, I sleep in every day. Yeah, I have books I need to get written, but I write them when I feel like writing. Then at least for the last 3 years, for 5 months out of the year, I work like crazy. But that means, going to a production studio and, meeting with lots of interesting artists and, working with directors and actors to make a TV show. And for some reason, that doesn't feel like the slow death that an office job felt like. Now, to be fair, I want to stop doing that as soon as I can, because the part where I just sit at home and play video games with my wife still beats everything else. But yeah, I guess this is how I'm going to be able to retire at 50, is doing all this crap now. Yeah.
I mean, it's pretty awesome to think about where all of this started and see where it's come so far, and you're not even done yet. I don't think any of us at the time. So you started this whole thing I actually didn't know this. I learned this from listening to a different podcast, that you actually had created this to be a multiplayer online game, and I had no idea about that. I had thought that we were the first, our RPG campaign that we were running on my website for a while, but certainly none of us.
That was the first time it actually got used in gaming. I mean, the concept. You remember, right?
Oh yeah.
She was the one who actually brought me the idea of helping her develop an MMO property, because her uncle was I think he was an attorney for a Chinese ISP, and they had come to him and said, we would really love to develop an MMO that was exclusively available to people who subscribe to our internet service. Sort of like a little way to make their internet service more attractive to, at that time, the Chinese public was finally getting to join the internet in huge numbers, and so it was a booming business. And he went to her, and she came to me because she had never played video games really. So I came up with the idea of it for that, but that never went anywhere. The ISP didn't understand what they were asking for. So, when they really looked at it and went, oh yeah, this will cost $100 million to develop, they realized that was never going to work. But then that's the seeds of that are what I used to create the tabletop role-playing game version.
We had a lot of fun back then. That wasn't our first game. I always sometimes wonder if you'll end up doing something with the other campaigns that that was the thing that I think we all really loved about your games at the time, was how fleshed out the worlds always seemed to be. Like they're always, it always kind of felt like, because you had a group of people who, most of them were pretty decent writers and pretty imaginative, and kind of some of them pretty explicitly don't tell me what to do kind of people, and always kind of going off in directions that certainly I didn't expect them to go, but it never really seemed to shake you at all. You always just, it was as though you had foreseen that we would do that, and you were always ready for it. Was always very impressive. So you're a good DM.
Well, thanks. I mean, if I have a writing superpower, it's world building. For whatever reason, by the time I start writing something, you're right, the whole world exists in my head, so it almost doesn't matter what the characters want to do, or in the case of a game, what the players want to do, because it's all there, so they can kind of go wherever they want.
It's something I know you've talked a lot before. I've seen you and Daniel talk about this when you come to do signings and things like that. That you always mention that you know how it's going to end. You know, you've already sort of got the arc planned out. And first of all, so the 7th book just came out a couple months ago, Persepolis Rising, which I just wanted to say, since I had the chance, I enjoyed the hell out of it. And moreover, that I was thinking about it, especially in the context of having seen this story from a pretty early stage, that I was not at all expecting the scope of this series, that I was not at all expecting that it was going to cover such a large time span and so much change throughout the series. And I really enjoy that about the series, how, you know, you've got these sort of, you know, I understand you have it planned for 9 books. You've sort of got it structured in 3 sort of sub-trilogies, with each one happening at a different point in time. And I don't know why, but I wasn't expecting that. And it's been a really pleasant surprise for me.
Yeah, I guess it is unusual in series fiction. I mean, I certainly think something like, you know, George Martin's Song of Ice and Fire has that sort of scope where it takes you from the quasi-medieval version that Game of Thrones happens in, and then you end up in sort of the high fantasy dragons and fire wizards and all that the later books end up at, and across a large span of time. But I guess you don't see it a ton in sci-fi, and I'm not sure why that is. But, you know, we always said that the series was to take humanity from late Apollo 13 to early Buck Rogers, going through that transition from tech that we would recognize to the sort of version of the galaxy that we would not recognize.
Yeah. Well, and that transition has been handled, I think, really in a way that feels very natural. I know that is something that with the early books, people were talking a lot about, how it was not a distant future scenario that you were imagining. And I know for myself, the parallel that really came to mind immediately was Alien, the Ridley Scott movie Alien. That what everybody, including myself, loves about Alien is how you have these people who it's just their job to be out there. They're truckers in space, and everything is just completely unimpressive and dirty, and to them it's no big deal. You have a lot of that same feeling in the first 3 books here, where nothing seems implausible. But then as we move through this, it's almost like, you know, by the time we get to this 7th book and things are very, very different, it almost kind of seems like it snuck up on you somehow, but it doesn't feel jarring at all. And that seems like a difficult thing to pull off. Was that hard?
I don't know. It was that, honestly, that's something I never thought about. I think knowing what the end is and where you're going helps, because it makes the sort of foreshadowing and all the stuff that you have to build in much easier and feel much more natural. I think it's jarring when some series entertainment, be that a television show or a book series or anything like that, where it changes course in a way that doesn't feel planned out. Mm-hmm. I mean, I can mention any number of TV shows that I've watched where at some point, either in a later season or late in the first season or whatever, where you're going along and you get hit that episode where you go, oh, they don't know where they're going.
Yeah.
They don't know where this is going. They're just making it up as they go now.
Yeah.
And I think knowing the ending keeps you from ever doing that. It keeps the reader from ever having that experience where they're like, oh, they don't actually know where this is going. They're just sort of making it up as they go.
Yeah, and I can certainly think of some other TV series that have done that. But then there's a recent TV, I don't know if I want to name names, but there's a recent TV series, a concurrent TV series that almost seems like it has the opposite problem, where I can tell that they were setting up over the course of the first season a certain reveal that they had in mind from the beginning, and it just had no, when it happened, it just had no stakes at all. It just didn't feel important, or, because they reveal something about this character that is supposed to be shocking, but because you're not attached to anybody really in a way that they might hope, they haven't spent enough time with the characters, it just ends up feeling really inert. Whereas what you do, you have a bunch of really big sort of shakeups that happen over the course of this series, and every one feels very impactful. And so trying to thread that where you know what's coming, so you're not able to feel like you're lost, but also that you're not, that you are also properly, making things matter to the reader that also seems difficult.
You don't need to know what's coming, but you need to feel like after it happens that it was inevitable.
Yeah.
That's the trick. Robin Veith, one of the writers on our TV show, the phrase she used to describe it was surprising inevitability, which I've always loved. I think that's a fantastic term.
Yeah.
That's what you're always aiming for, surprising inevitability, where when the thing happens, you're totally taken by surprise, but you immediately go, well, of course that's what had to happen. The one that Daniel mentions all the time is the first season of Veronica Mars. I don't know if you ever watched that show.
I didn't.
The first season of it is a masterwork. It's an absolutely perfect season of television. And the thing is, when you get to the very last episode, it begins with a murder. And, it's network TV. It's like 21 or 22 episodes that season. So it's a long season. And when you hit the last episode and you discover who the murderer was from the first episode, you're like, of course that's who it was. Of course that's who it was. And you had no idea up until that moment. But the minute they show you who it is, all of the pieces were there. Like your brain goes back through all the things you've seen involving that person and fills in all the gaps, and you immediately go, of course I should have known. That's really tricky to do, but when you can pull it off, it's incredibly satisfying for the consumer. Because you give them a surprise, but you also make them feel like they were part of every element of the story up to that point. The trick is, if they feel distanced from it, if they feel like they were never given the clues that could have let them solve the mystery, then they're just passive observers at that point. And I think maybe that's what you're talking about, is you start feeling like a passive observer.
I think part of it also just has to do with being invested in the characters, which I think is another thing that, between the two of you've set up these scenarios that are sort of really politically interesting, or, action interesting, or idea interesting, but then also populated them with characters that over the course of this series we get really connected to, so that when things happen to them, we care. I think that's really important.
Yeah, it is. And, it's everybody's trying to do that. Sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. And I don't think any of us really understand. It's sort of like publishing. Everybody claims to be an expert, and nobody really understands how any of it works.
Yeah.
I mean, because honestly, if anyone understood how it worked, we'd all be writing bestsellers, and publishing houses would only ever publish bestsellers. But clearly, that doesn't happen. So everybody is still figuring it out, and that creating characters that people become attached to. I think every content creator thinks they're doing that. And then it's only after the fact, when the audience has a chance to react to it, that you get to see whether it worked or not.
Yeah. So this idea of being surprised was something, I like that idea a lot. And I was sort of wondering, because I know that when you've described in talking to other people, other interviews or whatever, you've talked about that you have sort of the broad beats of the arc of the full series already sort of laid out, or at least that was my understanding. And you kind of know what each book needs to do in order to contribute to that arc. what I was sort of wondering is, have there been things that as you've progressed through it and worked on it, have there been things that surprised you that sort of came out in the writing process that you weren't necessarily planning beforehand?
I mean, there's always little surprises, and it's less. So I don't mythologize the creative process like I think some people do. I don't talk about how my characters write themselves, and I'm just there to transcribe for them. If that's true for other people, it's not true for me. So it's not like the story is telling me what it is, but at the same time, you certainly get to places where you intended to do something, and something in your mind says it's not going to work now. That's what you meant to do, but now that you're here, like all the stuff that has come before, that's not going to. You're not either you're not earning it, or it feels false now. It feels out of character now. I mean, that happens. You just roll with the punches, and and it's usually minor stuff. It's usually character stuff. It's usually not big plot stuff.
Okay, that makes sense. So with these characters now, I guess sort of a follow-up to that would be now, the way that I understand it is, so each of these books is constructed in such a way that in each chapter you have a different point of view character. So you have, in the first book, I think it was just 2 point of view characters, and then as things have expanded, you will sometimes have, maybe 6 or 7 or more point of view characters throughout a book. But we
only did that once.
Okay. But
no, we all the books after the first one have had 4.
Mm-hmm.
Babylon's Ashes, because we were very deliberately writing our big war book, our sort of our War and Peace, as pretentious as that sounds. That's why we expanded the scope of it, because showing it from a lot of different angles made it feel more epic.
Mm-hmm.
But it's just that one time, and we're not doing that again.
So, but this is right, like that at least in the way that each chapter starts. I know you go back and forth and edit each other and take different passes through each chapter, but as each book starts, each of you is sort of taking a character and you write all the chapters for those characters. Is that right?
Early on, that's what we did. It's less and less like that as time has gone on. At this point, we divided up based on content now. I mean, early on, we felt like each of us had characters we were better at writing, but the longer this project has gone on, the less that is true. I mean, in the last book, in Persepolis, we kind of just wrote whatever chapter was next, and I don't think anybody noticed any real radical changes in tone from one chapter to the next with the same character. What we're doing in the current book we'll sort of outline the next 2 chapters, and I'll go, well, this one's pretty, action heavy, and that one is very angsty. Why don't you take the angsty one and I'll do the action heavy one? And who the character is almost irrelevant.
Yeah. I guess I was just sort of wondering, that sort of answers the first part of the question that I had, which was whether it was like the same person writing the same POV characters throughout the series, but so that's kind of no then. But then the other thing was like whether you had sort of a character that you particularly liked to write, whether there were any particular favorites of yours.
I don't know. I mean, I like them all when I'm writing them. I get bored easily. I do. I if I do the same thing for too long, I just get tired of doing it. So that's why I'll never be like a master of anything. I like all my artistic pursuits. I drew for a while. I got really into drawing for a while, and I got to the point where I felt like I could draw pretty well, and then I just stopped because, like, once I was good at it, then I just wasn't interested anymore. For things like writing, like if I was writing the same character and I felt really comfortable writing that character over and over and over again, then that comfort would bore me. So what I'm mostly looking for with the characters is are they different? Are they something? Am I being forced to do something that I'm not comfortable doing? Which is why people are often surprised at the characters that I have written, because they're so unlike me. The character of Basia, who's a conflicted father who's desperately trying to protect his children from the terrible choices that he's made. I wrote that character, and like I don't have kids, and like that whole parental thing is completely foreign to me. But that's part of what makes that character interesting to write, is that I'm forced to inhabit a skin that I don't normally do. I wrote Anna in Abaddon's Gate, who's a lesbian mother Methodist minister. Like, no combination of those things is me. But that's what makes her interesting. So I think that rather than having a character that I find interesting, what I find interesting is writing something that I don't know how to do, because then I have to learn a new skill. The minute that I feel like I'm not learning any new skills, then I just don't want to do it anymore.
I guess that's how you keep everything fresh, like on a project like this, where it's, taking you, it's going to be the better part of a decade by the time you're done with it. You have to have some way of keeping yourself engaged with it, not to mention just the readers. So I guess that seems like a good way of doing that.
Well, it's also the reason that every book is a different genre.
Oh yeah, well that's a good point. I hadn't really thought about that.
It's not boring. There is a subset of the first book's fan base who never forgave us for not just writing Leviathan Wakes over and over again. That's what they wanted. They wanted space noir mystery over and over and over and over again, and got increasingly angry as each book came out and wasn't that.
Yeah.
But I don't care. I'm not going to write the same thing over and over again because it would bore the shit out of me, and so those are just going to be disappointed people.
Yeah, I guess, even in talking to some of our mutual acquaintances, obviously we all read these books. It's interesting to see which ones of them land more strongly with each of us. Like, I think, Burn was more Western for the sort of cross genre. Like, I'm just such a sucker for Westerns, but then I remember some of our friends feeling, I'm not that into Westerns, but like, obviously we're all still following along, but some of these things are just going to hit harder with some of us than the rest of us, I guess.
Well, but certain stories lend themselves to certain genres. We're telling a story about a land rush and people staking a claim that then the large corporation comes along and goes, oh no, you never actually owned this, and eminent domain, we're just taking it. That is a Western story. That is the quintessential Western story. The sheep rancher getting run off his land by the cattle rancher, and the cattle rancher getting run off his land by the railroad company. Those are the quintessential Western stories. So if you're telling a story about that kind of thing happening, I don't know what genre better matches that.
Yeah, definitely. There's one more thing. We have to switch to the next segment pretty soon, but there's another thing that I wanted to sort of touch on before we move on, and that is that, so I know that when, the writing of a book is a fairly lengthy process, even for somebody like you guys who are, really pumping them out one a year. That's a lot. You're coming out with a new one every year. But even at that, it's not as though it just can't work out that the things that are happening currently in the world, when the book comes out, you're obviously not responding to those in real time because there's too much of a delay there. But at the same time, a lot of the stuff in these books, even from the very beginning, has always felt really like applicable to things as I'm reading them. And like in this book, for example, there are a bunch of scenes after the Laconians show up where people are reacting to this crisis and talking about it or noticing how other people are responding to it that just felt really, really familiar and appropriate to 2017. And I was just sort of wondering, like, how much of that, I know that these are all things that you've sort of been thinking about and planning, at least the broad strokes of it, for a while, but I just was wondering how much the world that we live in comes into these books, or how much these books are intended to comment on what we're living through.
I don't think any of it is intentional. WikiLeaks happened right around the same time the first book came out, and everybody was like, "Oh, Holden is a comment on information freedom and WikiLeaks and all that," and he wasn't. We had written that book a year before it came out, so it had nothing to do with WikiLeaks. Just a happy accident. But yeah, every book is about the time that it's written in, whether it's set 1,000 years in the past or 1,000 years in the future, whatever time the writer is living in, that's what the book is about. Just, moved to a different setting. You can't help but write that way. People always will write the emotional and sort of intellectual place that they're currently into any setting. So, questions about like who gets to define what terrorism is and who gets to define what dictatorship is, and all of those questions, that is of the now, because the war on terror. You see all this stuff about the war on terror, and the thing that most people don't do when they're on this side of it is think, well, if I lived over there, I would probably be one of those people fighting our interference. I would be a terrorist, and I wouldn't think of myself that way. I would never think of myself as a terrorist. I would think of myself as a revolutionary. And one of my favorite comments somebody ever made about terrorism is, if the colonies hadn't won the Revolutionary War, they would have hung all of our founding fathers as terrorists, because they were. It's only because we won that history gets to say, well, no, they weren't terrorists, they were revolutionaries, because look, now they have a country. So all of that stuff winds up in there. And what is the correct way to deal with an absolutist dictator? Here in this country, we're seeing sort of this rise of absolutism that is actually fairly terrifying. And then suddenly it feels like we're commenting on that. But it was never intended to be that. It's just sort of the world we're living in right now. Those things are happening at the same time.
Yeah. And I guess, too, another thing in these books is that it's a pretty strong theme that history is very cyclical. Like, even within the series, in each time period, you see conflicts playing out that are similar to each other, just in sort of different configurations. And so maybe that has a lot to do with, like the idea that we're always just sort of, as people, playing out the same struggles over and over again. So these things will just sort of always feel relevant. I don't know, maybe that has something to do with it.
I think that's right, but I mean, it's not that we think history is cyclical. What we think is that humans haven't changed. I mean, if you study biology, human physiology has basically been unchanged for 150,000 years. That means the brains that we're using right now to like build rockets and cell phone towers and all the other shit we do are the same brains that we used to chase antelope across the plains with a spear in our hand. The hardware hasn't changed at all. And so what we see is that the impulses that we have, the instincts that we have, the basic drives and how we respond to those drives that we have, we're running on the same hardware that 150,000 years ago, if a guy was mean to you, you stabbed him with a sharp stick. If you liked a girl, you just grabbed her and carried her off. And those are the impulses that we're still dealing with. And I think civilization is amazing in our ability. Humans are amazing in our ability to sort of tamp that down and act civilized. But the impulses are all still kind of there. The impulse to have more than the guy next to you, the impulse to have the prettier mate than the other guy, the impulse to hurt people who you think are trying to hurt you. That's all really basic hindbrain stuff, and it hasn't changed in a really long time. And so the idea that in the space of 100 years, we went out into space, and so all of a sudden all those instincts are magically gone, I think that's a ludicrous position to take. It's all still going to be there, and the only thing we can do is keep muddling on the way we do now, which is try to fight those impulses, try to be better than sort of our basic nature. But that's, it's a hit or miss proposition. We're not always great at defeating those impulses.
Yeah. Well, why don't we take a quick little break, and then we'll come back and do the second segment. So for the second segment, I always invite the guest to bring a topic of their own, which can be whatever you feel like talking about, whatever's on your mind. So what would you like to talk about today?
Well, yeah, that's interesting, because I usually try not to think about things. But so we were invited recently Daniel and I were invited to go out to Dubai for I think it's called the World Leadership Council. But apparently it's a big conference where people in government from all over the world go to meet up and discuss current like policy things and try to foresee upcoming issues and how they might be addressed. I don't know. It feels like I haven't been to it before, so I'm not sure exactly how it's going to play out. But the way it sounded like was like a sci-fi convention, but for government policy wonks. So we were invited out there by the senior editor of Popular Science, who we've written several articles for, to talk about upcoming issues that have already been addressed by science fiction, but that actual policymakers are just now starting to grapple with. The one that we keep coming back to is who owns the stuff in space, which up till now hasn't really been an important question for anyone to answer. But suddenly it's becoming an important question, with a number of countries planning moon landings in the near future. Several people talking about Mars landings. You have companies that have been formed specifically for the purpose of determining the feasibility of asteroid mining. The question of who owns that stuff is it's now a real question. And of course, we've written a number of books on this topic. Who owns the things that are in space? Is it the first person to land there? I mean, that seems reasonable that if you spend the time and money to go someplace, that you should have the right to exploit the thing that you got to. But of course, only America has ever landed on the moon. There's like 7 American flags on the moon right now. I don't think anyone would seriously argue that America owns the moon. So just landing there first clearly is not enough to stake a claim on these extraterrestrial bodies. So what is? And unfortunately, this is going to make it less interesting. I don't know the answer to that, but I think it's a really important question right now, because when Elon Musk drops a Tesla on Mars, does he own Mars? Does he own the piece that the Tesla is sitting on? These are important questions.
Yeah.
I don't know how we're going to develop the answers to that.
It is an interesting question. I seem to recall maybe this was like 10 years ago. Maybe I don't even know if Wikipedia was around then, so maybe it wasn't that long ago. But I remember looking up something that there is actually, or I think I remember this, that there is a moon treaty that I think that this came up, back in the 60s when in the lead up to the American moon landing, that the countries got together and all signed a treaty saying that nobody owns the moon, that the moon is neutral territory. Yeah,
and the primary driver for that, though, was a treaty saying no one could militarize the moon. Because the real concern at that time was that nobody flew up and put a bunch of missile launchers on the moon. So yeah, there is a treaty that says it's neutral territory, but what that treaty does not address is if resources are found on the moon that are of value, can anyone just go get them?
Yeah.
So yes, we have a treaty that says you can't go and build a military base on the moon, which it seems perfectly sensible. You don't want, ICBM launchers on the moon pointing down at us. But so Duncan Jones' movie Moon is about harvesting the regolith for helium-3, which potentially, that's not based on junk science. The solar wind streaming off of the sun slamming into the moon, we believe probably is creating helium-3 in the regolith. And helium-3 is a rare isotope that could potentially be very useful in fusion. So if we get to a fusion-based economy where we're using fusion reactors, especially of the type that fuse helium-3 and lithium to produce energy, suddenly the fact that the moon is covered in potentially trillions of tons of helium-3, and helium-3 is almost impossible to find here on Earth. And if we have to create it, the act of creating it will consume more energy than we'll get out of fusing it. So it's not really a thing that you can make and then use in your fusion reactor. So we would have to go find natural sources of it. What if the moon is covered in natural sources of it? Who owns that? Is it owned by the first person to go up there and land a helium-3 tractor? These questions are not covered by the treaty that you're talking about.
Well, but so this is an interesting thing that these ideas about sort of space land grabs and stuff like that, which as you mentioned before, this is something that you've dealt with to some degree in your fiction. But I guess I wonder, you're going to be giving a talk about this. Are there any other authors' work that comes to mind in particular that sort of touches on that issue?
Sure, lots of them. Going back to the very beginning, Jules Verne with his moon landing, they got up there and there were already people there. So it read much more like a Christopher Columbus kind of thing, where the explorer lands on the new landmass and sticks his flag down and goes, I claim this for England, and then the natives come out and say, but we live here, so why does this belong to England? And then you've got the guys like Heinlein with Starship Troopers, who had a very militaristic view of this, which is you own anything that you can defend. Yeah, this is territory that has been covered quite a lot in science fiction, and with a lot of different answers. I don't think it should be this way, but I think Heinlein's version is probably the one that we're going to wind up with, because it's the one we have now here on Earth, which is the thing that makes you able to claim something is that after you've claimed it, you're able to defend it and keep other people from claiming it back. I don't know how else anybody claims anything on our Earth right now.
It certainly has always worked out that way throughout our history, which I guess is also an interesting thing that a lot of times I remember hearing some interviews or reading some interviews with different science fiction authors who sort of took issue with the idea that science fiction predicts anything, that it's always sort of taking the world as it is and working off of that rather than like trying to actually look towards the future. But I think it's an interesting idea that you could take something like the American frontier and how, that was colonized, and apply that to, future frontiers, whatever those might be. And science fiction certainly has a history of doing that.
It does, but I mean, what science fiction does is comment on what came before, which can feel predictive, because we tend to do the same things over and over again. But yeah, I mean, science fiction has a terrible track record of actually making accurate predictions of what the future is going to look like. I'm almost certain that we're never going to see anything like a William Gibson story as reality. When he was writing about cyberspace and 3D virtual environments to navigate computer networks, who knew that the simplest way to learn anything you need to learn is a search box called Google? Going into a 3D virtual environment maybe is fun as a game, but would be ridiculous as a way to actually get any work done. So we're just bad at predicting stuff. Every science fiction writer is bad at it. I mean, every now and then you have an accidental lucky thing, Arthur C. Clarke with communication satellites and that kind of thing. But we're just not good at it, because most people aren't good at seeing the obvious things from the future. Even people who are like professional futurists tend to be bad when it comes to predicting the future. But what we can do is say, here's what human nature is, and here's what we've done over and over again since the beginning of recorded history, and here's a new thing. How does that new thing fit into what we always do? And, when you look at like the potential for enormous wealth, I mean, you look at things like asteroid mining, there is potentially enormous wealth out there in the many, 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 many trillions of dollars level. So you got people, these asteroid mining companies that are spinning up and saying, well, we're trying to figure out if it's feasible to mine asteroids. Do we honestly believe any government on Earth is going to go, no, it's cool if a bunch of private citizens become trillionaires because they drag back, 100 tons of platinum in asteroid form? I just don't see governments being okay with that. I don't see governments going, it's okay that private citizens are richer than our country because they were willing to send a spaceship up and go get all this.
Yeah.
It just doesn't seem likely or reasonable. So the question of, if I send a spaceship up and I go find an asteroid made out of platinum and suddenly I'm an overnight trillionaire, is everybody going to be cool with me just bringing that back and keeping it? I say no.
I think, this is sort of an interesting thing here that, we can't necessarily predict the future, but we do more or less know what happened in the past. And I guess the question always is, are we actually able to learn something from the past so that we're not always just doing the same thing over and over again? I don't know. It seems like an open question. The optimist in me would like to think that we do, but...
We do. It's slow. It's an iterative process. And periodically we all sort of suffer a mass hallucination, a mass insanity, and we run backwards a bunch of steps. And then we slowly start inching forward again. But the progress is mostly in the right direction, over time. It's like the stock market. If you're willing to stay in it long enough, you'll always make money. But for the people who just lost all their money in a huge crash, it doesn't feel that way. So, I think we're going through some weird stuff right now here on Earth. I think we're seeing the death throes of some fairly pernicious worldviews, and, a wounded animal is always the most dangerous. I think we're seeing a lot of what makes those worldviews dangerous as they recognize their own mortality. And that's going to suck for a while, but you come out the other side of it and it'll start getting better again. I think we mostly do move in the right direction. The question for me, though, on the space stuff is, as we discuss in our books, is what gives anyone the right to make those decisions? In Siva Laverne, the colonists who land on Illis and claim it for their own, when the chartered UN ship shows up and says, "Oh no, we were given the charter for this planet," the people on the planet, I think quite justifiably, say, "Why does the UN own this planet? What gives them the right to give a charter?" And I think since nobody currently owns space, the real issue is going to be, I fly my spaceship up there, I start mining asteroids. Somebody's going to say, "Oh wait, you can't do that. You need a license to mine asteroids from us." Which country gets to say that? Who's going to make that claim? Who's going to make that power grab?
I guess we'll find out.
Well, and I think it's going to be really messy, because I think the minute money is involved, that's when everybody suddenly gets really interested.
Yeah, that does seem to be the way it works out. So I know you have to get going pretty soon, but there's one question that I always ask everyone before we close, and that is whether there is a piece of art or literature or just general creativity that you've experienced recently that meant something to you.
Well, I thought The Shape of Water was beautiful.
I haven't seen that yet, but I've heard a lot of different opinions about it. But I think the beautiful part is something that everybody seems to agree on.
Yeah, it actually was literally like watching a piece of art. I don't know how effective it will be for most people as a movie, but as a piece of art, it's stunning. Yeah, I was really surprised by it. And there's also a version of it where you watch it and it watches like a prequel to Hellboy, but it is an absolutely beautiful thing.
Del Toro definitely has a pretty amazing visual aesthetic and ability to translate that on screen. Do you find in general that you like his movies?
Oh, I do. Yeah. So the knock on Del Toro is what I just said. I think for some people, his movies don't work like movies, and they have a certain expectation of what a movie does, and oftentimes his movies do not do that thing. And so they don't like them, but I'm much more of I'm willing for you to tell me what you're doing and then judge whether or not I think you're doing that thing well. One of my least favorite book criticisms is with the rise of the amateur book critic all over the internet, you see this a lot where the person spends the whole time talking about the book they would have written. Mm-hmm. I think that's pointless and uninteresting. I think what's interesting is, what was the person trying to do, and did they accomplish the thing that they were trying to do? Yeah.
And then each person can decide for themselves whether that thing is something that's important to them. But
exactly.
Yeah.
That's exactly right. Yeah. Does that thing matter to you? Do you enjoy that kind of thing? And with Del Toro, all of his movies seem to be different projects where he's trying something different. And so when I watch one of his movies, I just say, okay, what are we doing today? And then, and because of that, I tend to enjoy almost everything he does, because no matter what he's doing, he does a beautiful job of it.
Yeah.
I really like his stuff. And then I would say the other thing is not so much a thing I enjoyed recently, but a thing that I have repeatedly enjoyed and have been thinking about a lot lately is the Earthsea Trilogy by Ursula Le Guin, because of course she just recently died, and so I've been thinking about her a lot, and thinking about those books and how important they were to me. as a kid and now as an adult as well. Yeah, so if your listeners haven't read Ursula Le Guin, they definitely should do that. She was one of the greatest writers in our field.
There's really nobody else like Le Guin, that's for sure. Yeah,
honestly, she is the reason I never engaged with Harry Potter, I think, because the minute that there was a school for wizards, like my brain I immediately just wanted to go reread Wizard of Earthsea again. Like I didn't care about the book I was reading. I didn't care about Harry Potter. I like reading about him just annoyed me because it wasn't Wizard of Earthsea. So she kind of preemptively spoiled me for enjoying Rowling's work.
That's interesting. My son right now is he's 9. He's my oldest, and he's kind of obsessed with Harry Potter. And it's really interesting because I was almost exactly his age the first time I read A Wizard of Earthsea, and so I'm really looking forward to. I think that's going to be the next book we read together, and I'm really looking forward to seeing how he reacts to it.
Yeah, I'd be curious because I think those projects occupy so much of the same space that I bet your experience of it is heavily colored by whichever one you engaged with first.
Yeah. Well, I really appreciate you taking the time and talking with me. Thanks so much.
Yeah, thank you, man.
Okay, so as I mentioned at the top, I'm giving away a signed copy of Ty and Daniel's book, Persepolis Rising. If you would like to enter the drawing for that book, here's what you do. First, sign up for the show's email newsletter by going to keepthechannelopen.com/connect and filling out the form there. And if you're already signed up, great. You're done with that step. Next, just drop me an email at podcast@keepthechannelopen.com and let me know that you're entering the drawing. And that's it. But if you'd like to increase your odds, once you're signed up for the newsletter, you can tweet out about the episode and tag me at ChannelOpenPod to get an extra entry. And all Patreon subscribers also get an extra entry. So good luck, everybody. I'll be announcing the winner on Facebook and Twitter on Wednesday, March 21st. And that is our show. If you'd like to get in touch, you can find all of the show's contact and social media info in the show notes. If you'd like to support the show, a monthly pledge in any amount to our Patreon campaign is greatly appreciated. You can find that at patreon.com/sakeriver. That's sake like the drink and river like river. Our theme music is by Poddington Bear. You can find more of his music available for licensing at soundofpicture.com. We will be back on March 28th with a conversation with poet Devin Kelly, so be sure to come back for that one. And until then, remember, keep the channel open.